The clinking of silverware against china should have been a comforting sound that evening, a familiar rhythm in the Donovan household where family dinners were usually a rare and cherished event. But as Claire sat across from Ethan, her fork idly moving peas around her plate, she felt the subtle undercurrent of tension humming beneath the polite chatter. She was 6 months pregnant, her belly rounding gently under her soft blue dress, and she had been glowing with anticipation for this dinner, until 2 days ago, when her world quietly cracked. It had started with an anonymous message. Just a few sentences and a blurry photo on her phone, sent from an unknown number. It showed Ethan, her husband of 3 years, the CEO of a rapidly growing tech firm, leaning far too close to a brunette in a sequined dress at a rooftop bar. His hand rested on the small of the woman's back, his smile warm and familiar in a way that was supposed to be reserved for her. The message claimed it had been taken a week ago, after one of his so-called late strategy meetings. Claire had stared at the screen for a full minute, feeling a strange, detached calm, as though her brain had placed her on emotional mute so she could process. For 2 days, she said nothing. She moved through her routines, shopping for baby clothes, answering texts from friends, listening to Ethan talk vaguely about work. But every time he met her eyes, she searched for cracks in his expression. And tonight, with his parents, sister, and her own mother gathered around the polished oak table, she found herself watching him like a hawk, waiting for an opening. Ethan's sister, Victoria, was chattering about her upcoming engagement party. "It's going to be at the lakeside house," she said, sipping her wine. "Of course, Ethan will be giving a little toast, right? The family CEO has to bless the occasion." Ethan smiled faintly, but his gaze slid toward Claire. "Of course," he said. "As long as Claire's feeling up to it. We're a bit preoccupied these days." The way he said, "we," made her grip her fork harder. Preoccupied, she thought. That's one word for it. Her mother, seated beside her, touched her arm gently. "You've been glowing lately, dear. I think the baby's bringing out the best in you." Claire forced a smile, but something hot twisted in her chest. The baby. Their baby. The one she'd been afraid to tell him about at first because she knew how consumed he was with his company's expansion. The one he'd smiled about, hesitantly, but with what she thought was real joy, when she finally told him. And now, she couldn't stop replaying the thought that maybe his sudden restlessness after the news wasn't just stress. Across the table, Ethan's father was telling some story about corporate mergers, but Claire wasn't listening. Her mind was turning over the possibilities. Maybe the photo was misleading. Maybe he had been comforting a colleague. Maybe this was all some misunderstanding. But her gut, honed over years of reading the subtle shifts in his tone and body language, told her otherwise. "Claire," Victoria's voice broke through her thoughts, "you're awfully quiet tonight. Everything okay?" All eyes turned toward her. She could feel Ethan stiffen beside her. She set her fork down, deliberately. "Actually," she said, her voice deceptively light, "I've been thinking a lot about honesty in relationships lately. You know, trust, loyalty, that sort of thing." Victoria's brows rose. Ethan's father frowned slightly. And Ethan himself gave a short, careful laugh. "That's an interesting dinner topic," he said. "Isn't it?" Claire leaned back in her chair, resting one hand on her belly. "Because the thing is, when you're expecting a child with someone, you sort of assume they'll be fully present, physically and emotionally." Her mother's hand on her arm tightened slightly, as if sensing where this might be headed. Ethan's eyes met hers, and she could see the faint warning in them. "Don't do this here." But she had already decided. "And it's funny," she continued, "how a single picture can make you wonder if you really know the person you're building a life with." The room went utterly still, except for the faint clink of Victoria setting down her wine glass. "What picture?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Claire." She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and with a few taps brought up the image. She laid it face up in the center of the table, her hand sliding away as though it burned. "That picture. Victoria leaned in, eyes widening. Ethan's mother inhaled sharply. His father's expression hardened. Ethan didn't move at first, he just stared at the photo like he could erase it through sheer force of will. That's not what it looks like, he said finally, his voice calm but clipped. Claire gave a short, humorless laugh. Really? Because to me, it looks like you and some woman I've never met are sharing a very intimate moment. It was a networking event, he said, his tone tightening. We were discussing. Discussing, she interrupted, with your hand on her back. The air felt thick, heavy with the unspoken. Her mother's face was pale, lips pressed together. Victoria looked between them like she was watching a car crash in slow motion. Ethan's father cleared his throat, but didn't speak. Claire, Ethan said, lowering his voice, this isn't the time or place. She met his gaze steadily. When is, Ethan? After the baby's born. After you've had more networking events. You think because you're busy being the big CEO, I'm just going to smile and ignore it. His calm veneer cracked for just a second, his eyes flashed, and his mouth tightened. I've been under pressure you can't imagine. The company. Don't, she said, her voice rising slightly, don't you dare blame the company. This isn't about deadlines or investors. This is about you making a choice. Silence fell again, broken only by the faint scrape of a chair as Victoria shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's mother finally spoke, her tone low and sharp. Ethan, is there something you're not telling us? Ethan exhaled slowly, looking like a man cornered. It was a stupid, meaningless mistake, he said, the words sounding dragged out of him. It happened once. I regretted it the second it happened. Claire's heart thudded dully in her chest. The admission hit harder than she expected, even after the photo. She'd been bracing for denial, for gaslighting. Instead, he'd handed her the truth like a blade. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let her voice shake. And you thought I'd never find out. His gaze dropped. I didn't want to lose you. You already have, she said, her voice flat. Her mother reached for her hand, but Claire didn't take it. She stood slowly, pushing back her chair. The room seemed to contract around her, everyone frozen in a mix of shock and awkwardness. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the hallway, her steps steady even though her insides felt like they were breaking apart. Behind her, she heard Ethan call her name, his voice strained. But she didn't stop. She had learned 2 days ago. Clinking of glasses and low hum of polite conversation filled the Grant family's dining room, the polished mahogany table groaning under the weight of roast beef, scalloped potatoes, and a dozen side dishes laid out like a culinary competition. The chandelier light caught on the silver cutlery, sending little shards of brightness into the corners of the room where the air seemed just a touch too still. On the surface, it was a typical Sunday dinner, the kind that the Grants, wealthy, well-groomed, and determined to maintain appearances, had always hosted. But beneath that polished calm, tension wound tight enough to snap. Eleanor Grant, impeccably dressed in emerald silk, sat at the head of the table, her smile perfectly placed but her eyes darting between her son and his wife with the precision of a hawk. To her left was Jonathan, the CEO of the family's real estate empire, a man who knew how to fill a room with his voice, his charm, and his decisions. Tonight, though, his usual confidence was missing. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly, his jaw tight in a way that made his sister, seated across from him, raise an eyebrow. At his side, Amelia looked like she'd been sculpted from porcelain, her dark hair drawn into an elegant chignon, her hands resting on the table in deliberate stillness. She was newly pregnant, though the news had not yet been announced to the extended family. Only Jonathan knew. Or rather, Jonathan had known, before everything fell apart. 2 weeks earlier, she'd told him in the privacy of their penthouse suite. She remembered how his eyes had widened in surprise, how the corners of his mouth had pulled into a smile that seemed genuine for all of 10 seconds before the shadows crept in. That same night, she'd found the text messages. They weren't even well hidden, just sitting there on his phone, blatant in their cruelty. The messages were to a woman named Lydia, someone Amelia vaguely recognized from one of Jonathan's corporate galas. Their flirtation wasn't new, but the timing made it a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The most recent exchange had been dated just hours after Amelia's announcement. The betrayal was bad enough, but the callousness, cheating right after learning about the baby, was a different kind of cruelty. Amelia hadn't confronted him immediately. She'd waited. And now, in the midst of this family dinner, with the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the air, she was ready. Jonathan reached for the wine, pouring himself a generous glass before topping off his sister's. To family, he said, raising his glass with a smile that almost passed for normal. To family, they echoed, though Amelia's voice was softer, her eyes fixed on him in a way that made him briefly shift in his seat. They began eating, and for a while, the conversation was harmless. Talk of market trends, the upcoming charity gala, and Jonathan's latest expansion project. But then Eleanor asked, "So, when are you two going to give me another grandchild?" The room went quiet just long enough for Amelia to feel every heartbeat in her chest. She placed her fork down slowly, a faint smile on her lips. "Actually," she began, "we just found out we're expecting." Gasps, laughter, and congratulations erupted around the table. Jonathan managed a smile, but it looked plastered on. His mother clasped her hands in delight, his sister leaned across the table to touch Amelia's arm, and his father beamed like the news was the best thing to happen all year. Amelia let them enjoy the moment for exactly 5 seconds. "Of course," she continued, "it's been a little complicated. Not the pregnancy itself, thankfully that's healthy, but the circumstances." Jonathan's head whipped toward her. "Amelia," he began, his voice low, warning. She didn't stop. "See, I told Jonathan the news, and a few hours later, I found out he was celebrating with someone else. Someone named Lydia. Does that ring a bell, Jonathan?" The air seemed to suck out of the room. Eleanor's smile froze mid-expression. His sister's eyes went wide, while his father frowned in confusion. Jonathan set his glass down with a sharp clink. "This isn't the time or place," he said through clenched teeth. "Oh, I think it's exactly the time and place," Amelia replied, her tone calm, almost conversational. "After all, your family should know what kind of man you are before they toast to your future as a father." Amelia. "No," she said firmly. "You knew I was pregnant, and your response was to crawl into bed with another woman. I kept my mouth shut for 2 weeks because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd own up to it. But here we are, pretending everything is fine over roast beef." His sister broke the silence first, her voice a mixture of shock and disgust. "Is this true?" she demanded, looking at Jonathan. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking between his wife, his plate, and his mother. "It's more complicated than that." "Complicated?" Amelia let out a small, humorless laugh. "Was it complicated when you texted her that she was so much more exciting than your pregnant wife? Was it complicated when you made dinner plans with her the night I was home with morning sickness?" Eleanor's hand shot to her pearls as though the clutching might shield her from the scandal bleeding across her tablecloth. "Jonathan," she said, her voice sharp, "tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." Jonathan opened his mouth, but Amelia spoke first, pulling her phone from her clutch. "I have the messages. I'd be happy to read them aloud." "Don't," he snapped, his voice cracking with more panic than anger. But Amelia wasn't bluffing. Her thumb hovered over the screen, and the silence was so thick she could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. His father set down his fork with a deliberate clatter. "Jonathan, you'd better start talking before she does." Jonathan rubbed a hand over his face, his carefully constructed composure collapsing. "It was a mistake," he muttered. "A one-time. One time." Amelia cut in, her voice cool. "The messages spanned 3 months, Jonathan." The room shifted. Jonathan's sister pushed her chair back slightly, as though putting physical space between herself and her brother's shame. Eleanor's gaze had hardened into something cold and assessing, the kind of look that weighed damage and consequences. I made a mistake, Jonathan repeated, his voice quieter now. I was scared. The pregnancy, it caught me off guard, and I. You ran to someone else, Amelia said, finishing for him. Because fear is such a noble excuse. No one spoke for a long moment. Even the food, now cooling on their plates, seemed irrelevant. Finally, Eleanor exhaled slowly. We will not be discussing this further at the table, she said, her voice like ice. Jonathan, you will deal with this, privately. And Amelia, she hesitated, as though unsure whether to console or caution her daughter-in-law. You and I will talk later. Amelia gave a small, tight nod, but the damage had been done. The perfect family dinner was shattered, replaced by an unspoken truth that would hang in the air long after the plates were cleared. Jonathan sat stiffly, his appetite gone, his gaze fixed on his untouched wine. Amelia picked up her fork again, taking a small bite of potatoes as though nothing had happened, though inside, her heart was still pounding, and her hands were trembling just slightly beneath the table. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But tonight, at least, the first crack had been made in Jonathan Grant's immaculate facade. And Amelia had no intention of letting it close.